Okay, hello everybody. So today's video is on what are called denormal numbers. So the name immediately suggests there's something odd about them. They're not normal, but they're not abnormal. They are denormal. So they are different than normal in some way. So what are they about? Well, first of all, some background. The general idea of denormal numbers is dealing with the fact that 0 is special, mathematically, and as far as computers are concerned. So there are certain things that you just can't do with 0 that you can do with normal numbers. You can happily divide by any number except 0, but you can't divide by 0. It's mathematically meaningless. And when you go onto a computer, that actually becomes very important, because the way that computers represent non-integer numbers means that they can only represent them to a certain level of precision. When the number gets too small, it becomes indistinguishable from 0. And this becoming indistinguishable from 0 is something that you want to put off as far as possible, because once it becomes 0, it does all these weird mathematical things. You can't divide by it, all kinds of other problems happen. So you want to put off that point as far as is even remotely possible. And denormal numbers are part of how you do that, putting it off. You keep a number non-zero for longer by making it one of these denormal numbers. And you'll see what that means when we come to it. So first of all, I have to talk briefly about how numbers are represented in computers generally. So for whole numbers, for integers, computer can represent them exactly so long as you limit the range. In the same way that, if you take a finite number of decimal digits, you can represent any number between, if you take 2 digits, you can represent any number between 0 and 99 if you're considering only the positives. And the same is true for computers, but with binary digits rather than decimal digits. So long as you restrict the range, you can represent all the numbers within a known range. For real numbers, that isn't true. One of the properties of real numbers is there is always another real number between any two real numbers you pick. Between 1.5 and 1.6, there's 1.55. But between any two of those, there's another one in the middle. You can always do that subdivision. So you can't just limit the range the way you can with integers. You have to, in some sense, represent a limit or introduce a limit on how many decimal places, for want of a better term, you can have. So let's just briefly look at how how numbers in general are represented in computers. So here's a simple thing, a different way perhaps of writing the number 2 million. So this is something there's a decent chance, if you come from a science or engineering background, you've seen, but these videos are designed to be accessible to everyone, so I'll briefly go through it. And the point is, I'm writing 2 million as 2 times 10 to the 6. And the reason for that is because, well, I can. 10 is just 10. 10 squared, 10 times 10 is 100. 10 cubed is 10 times 10 times 10 is 1,000. So I can effectively get any number of zeros I want by writing 10 to the power of the number of zeros that I want after my number. So I could write 20 as 2 times 10, which is 2 times 10 to the power of 1. I could write, 200 as 2 times 10 to the 2, and here I'm writing 2 million as 2 times 10 to the 6. And that is somewhat how computers write numbers that do not, this is a whole number. 2 million is a whole number, it's an integer, but this is how computers write numbers that are not integers. They write them as a combination of two integers. This integer here, which is generally called the significand, and this number here that's generally called the exponent. And this number here, which is the significand, and this number here, which is the exponent. And both of those numbers are always integers. And now this here is where it gets a bit weird, because if I actually wrote it like this, if I wrote 2 million as 2 times 10 to the 6, then I wouldn't be able to represent any numbers smaller than 1 million without this number here, this 6, going negative. Now, in reality, this 6 can go negative, but we'll pretend for what I'm talking about here that it can't. So what a computer would actually more do is if I wrote out 2 million, it would write it as 2 million times 10 to the 0, which is the same as if I wrote 20. It would write it as 20 times 10 to the 0. Okay? And that's fine. And if I wrote a more complicated number, like 2,345,678, it would write that in the same way as well. Now, what about if I wanted to take this number here and divide it by 10? Well, okay. What it would actually do is it would write it as 2,345,678. Oh, no, sorry. First, I multiply it by 10. So I get 23,456,780. And it writes it as 2,345,678 times 10 to the 1. Because I've incremented this number here so that our final number is 10 times bigger than it is here. But this bit I've written exactly the same. But what about if I wanted to go down by a factor of 10 instead of up? Well, what it would actually do for 234,567.8 is write it again as 2,345,678 times 10 to the minus 1. This minus 1 here means divide by 10, the same way that, 10 to the 1 means times 10, 10 to the minus 1 means divide by 10. That's what a real system would do. In reality computers, this is an analogy more than an exactness. If nothing else, I'm doing this in powers of 10. It's all done normally in powers of 2. But in reality, this exponent here would go negative and everything would just keep working. But eventually, this number would get so small that would stop working anyway. So we're just going to pretend that we can't. We can't go to negative exponents. So what we'd have to write instead would be 0,234,567 times 10 to the 0. And we've still got our number, except we've lost precision. This 0.8 at the end, that's just vanished. We can't represent it anymore. And if I divide it by 10 again, we get the same thing again, but now the 7's disappeared as well. And if I then finally divide it one more time, so I've now got a number about 2,300 odd, I've lost even more. So this is the point. I've stopped my number from going to 0, which would be the other thing I could do. If I didn't do this, I'd have to just say, okay, this number's now smaller. My leading number here is 0. The whole thing goes to 0. But I haven't. I've kept the number non-zero, but avoiding that, I have lost precision. I have said, here I have my full precision. I have 7 places, 7 numbers here. Here I only have 4. And that's what denormal numbers are. They are trading away precision in return for the ability to represent smaller numbers than you otherwise could. And this isn't just something I've made up. This definitely really happens, and you can demonstrate it fairly easily. So I'm going to demonstrate this in Fortran, because Fortran has a few useful functions for showing what's going on that would be a bit messier to do in something like C or C++. Okay. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to create a 32, as it actually is, a 32-bit real number, which I'm going to call n, and an integer, which I'm going to call I. And then just going to loop from I is 1 to 50. First of all, going to set n is 1. And I'm going to print n each time, and I'm then going to do n is n divided by 10.0. Okay, and I'm going to compile that program. This bit I could have written in any language, but okay, and I run that program, and here are the numbers. So I start out with 1, 0.1. This number is very nearly 0.01, but not quite. And this is another important thing to notice, of course, because of the fact that I only have a certain number of binary digits, the representation of my decimal digits is imprecise. If I was doing this in actual decimal, I could keep dividing by 10 every time, and that 1 would just march down the columns. But because 0.1 isn't exactly representable in binary, it's not a power of 2, I get these errors creeping in right from the start. But it's worth pointing out, all up here, their last 3 decimal places where the error is. It's 9.9999, and then you have 3 things here that are an error, that are not perfect, and you go down and you go down, and here are some that actually are really pretty good, some here that have errors going the other way in the last decimal place, and everything's fine until we reach these sort of numbers down here. And suddenly things start going really wonky. So, we go from last couple of things, this is now starting to get out to the 4th and the 5th decimal place. 5th, this is now wrong in the, the 2nd decimal place out there, and now it's wrong in the 1st, and now, it's really wrong in the 1st, and then suddenly it just goes to 0, which is that behavior I mentioned. Eventually the number becomes too small to represent in any way at all. And you might guess that this bit here where it all goes wrong is that denormalization process where it starts trading off that accuracy for the ability to represent the numbers. And fortunately, Fortran does give you a very easy way of finding that out, which is in the IEEE arithmetic module. So IEEE is the standards body that sets the standards that almost everybody uses for floating point numbers and how they're represented. So that's where IEEE comes in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to print the function IEEE is normal of n, which will tell me, is n a normal number? And effectively, normal is not just the opposite of denormal. Any of the IEEE special values, like infinity or not a number, are also not normal numbers, but for here I'm just using it to pick up denormal numbers. Okay, and I compile it and I run it again, and yeah, here we go. All the way from the top, it's true, they are normal numbers, and then here they become not normal numbers. And at that point, basically that's where you start seeing these errors creeping up. Even, this one here, the first one that's not normal, you couldn't really tell a difference there. But the one after it, yeah, we've never had one that's greater than 1 here in this significand that differs at anything other than the last decimal place, but suddenly it's the last 2, and then all the way through. And then finally, when it does go back to 0, of course, those are perfectly normal numbers. It's gotten to 0 by an unusual route, but it is just 0, which is a normal representable number. And it is worth pointing out that is one of the sort of subtleties of the IEEE system. 0 does not necessarily actually mean 0. It can, in some circumstances, mean a number too small to be represented, in the same way that the special infinity value doesn't mean mathematical infinity. It means a number too big to be represented. But that's basically it. Denormal numbers, they're there for a very good reason. If you didn't have them, then this jump down to 0 behavior here would happen here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 decades before it actually has to. Probably a bit more, because I'm not, jumping down in tens, I'll overshoot a bit. But as you can see, quite clearly, the accuracy of your numbers, these denormal numbers, becomes fairly poor. So that's the thing, denormals. They avoid this becoming 0 just when your number becomes too small. They push it off into the future a bit at the cost of losing some accuracy. And as a general rule, you want to make sure that you're not using denormal numbers except when you absolutely have to, because your answers are going to be not very good, and often it's very difficult to even quantify how bad they are. And things like this IEEE is normal function can be useful if you find yourself working with numbers that can get that small and you want to or need to check whether or not your numbers have become denormal. But that's it. It's a clever idea. The actual details are genuinely quite messy and quite complex, but it's not that hard to see what they're doing and why they're doing it. So we'll be back with another video next week.